Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. My name is John Bowman. I'm the president of the Duke Student Initiative on Social Entrepreneurship, or DUSICE. We're really happy to have Kunal Mehta here this evening to speak with you. I think that DUSICE's endeavor to do over the course of the semester is to invite people to interact with students who've done interesting and innovative things off the beaten path. So that Do Better has not only done interesting things off the beaten path, but has chronicled the efforts of others to do really interesting and innovative things. So Kunal Mehta is a strategy and finance associate at Charity Water. He's also the founder of Outpatient, a teleconferencing platform that physicians and patients connect, the founder of Mehta Apartments, and also most importantly for our conference evening, the author of Disruptors, a book that chronicles and gives insight into the stories of entrepreneurs who founded really important companies and organizations in the U.S. and maybe even around the world. So without further ado,
thanks. You can hold your applause. It might not be worth it, so just hold off until the end. Thanks so much for giving up your evening. I know there's a lot of exciting things going on around Duke this week, so appreciate you all coming here instead of the other events that are going on. I know there's a ton of really interesting professional, entrepreneurial experiences in the room, so I'm going to keep it pretty informal. Give me a chance to learn from you guys also after, and we can open up for some Q&A. Before I go any further, I just want to thank John and Catherine for putting this all together. They put a lot of work into it, so appreciate that. As way of introduction, my name is Kunal Mehta. I'm a recovering investment banker, an author, and an entrepreneur. 2 years ago, I left my job on Wall Street in search of some more inspiring and entrepreneurial work. And I hit some early heartbreaks and failures, but I've since bounced back, and I'm now the founder of a real estate venture in New York City. I'm working on a startup that will allow doctors and patients to video chat. And I'm also a finance and strategy associate at the nonprofit Charity Water that's provided clean and safe drinking water to over 5.2 million people worldwide. I think that's impact that really matters. I've had the unique privilege of going across business schools across the entire country, undergraduate and MBA programs. And what I've realized in this time is that many of us in business face a very tough decision. And that decision is, do you pursue the high status, high profile, high paying jobs that JP Morgan, McKinsey, BCG, Goldman Sachs offer, where status, reputation is pretty irrefutable? Or do you pursue something really far off the beaten path and something where career fulfillment and satisfaction might be more attainable? It's a pretty tough and agonizing decision that college graduates across the country are facing. And it's a decision that I'm hoping our conversations today and in the coming weeks or months, you can stay in touch with me, helps make it a bit easier. What helped me get through that and make that decision was through a better understanding of what else is out there. And that understanding came through a series of conversations with some of the greatest entrepreneurs of our generation. They're the founders of companies like Pinterest and Foursquare and other mobile applications that you're using. And these conversations happened at very raw moments in their careers. It happened in a side that we've heard about so often, with an 18 or 19-year-old who had been building for 3 or 4 months, stumbled on some entrepreneurial success, got venture-backed, and then found themselves on the cover of all the big magazines and blogs and tech journals and tech articles, and found that entrepreneurial fame that so many of us crave. And it's a story that we've heard about so often, and it's been beaten to death, and it's something that we've read about everywhere. But I want to focus on that. I want to focus on the other side of the spectrum. So I spoke with people in their late 30s, early 40s who had been building for 7, 8, 9, 10 years and never really found that same kind of success. But they were building with this passion in their stomach. And they were building towards something that they really cared about, something that they thought would be disruptive, but never found that success. But regardless of where they were, I found these stories very inspiring when I was sitting on Wall Street. So I've since taken these conversations and I've published them in a book titled Disruptors with the purpose to inspire more college students and business school students to pursue work that they really care about and that inspires them. So I've been on this book tour for the past few months, almost a year, and I've been working with a growing number of disenchanted consultants, lawyers, bankers, corporate escapees, and people who want to do something different and they want to be someone different, but they don't know how or where to begin. And I can empathize with them because when I was 17, I was offered a full scholarship by JP Morgan to attend the NYU Stern School of Business. And at the time, Wall Street seemed like the ideal profession to be in. I mean, it's books like Liar's Poker, movies like Boiler Room, now it's Wolf of Wall Street, and everything seems to make this seem like the ideal career to be in, where they're going to teach you transferable skills, and they'll set you up for a career that you might be proud of. But as I went in, reality slowly started to set in. At 19, I was one of the youngest investment bankers. And by 20, I realized just how much I hated it. I wanted to do something different. I wanted to be someone different. And the problem is that everywhere you look, there were people younger than myself who had decided to do what they cared about and were having an impact in industries, healthcare, mobile, technology, and nonprofit and social sectors, and really enjoying what they were doing. And at the same time, I started to develop this false sense of confidence because you're also interacting with the smartest of the smartest graduates across the country who have flocked to these jobs. So you're interacting with smart kids from people places like Duke and Columbia and Harvard and these really interesting places, and dealing with these managers that have been doing it for 20 years. And they're writing these reviews for you that tell you that you're intelligent enough, and if you do this job, your skills are eventually going to transfer to any other industry and you'll succeed at it. So you've developed this false sense of confidence that says, you know what, if I try to be an entrepreneur, within 6 months, I might have a $2 billion valuation in my head also. So in that false sense of confidence, I marched into my boss's office and I told him I quit. And I told him I want to do something different. I want to be someone different. And he had seen that same story so many times before. In that same false sense of confidence, I marched out of the exit doors and I saw this empty canvas of things I could build, and it was extremely exciting. And that excitement lasted a couple of days, a few weeks, and maybe a month before I realized that I had no idea what the hell I was actually doing. My savings account was tested. Mentors that I once looked up to were telling me that I'd made a very stupid decision in my career during one of the great recessions to leave a secure job. This resume you'd been building for 5 or 6 years was now pretty meaningless, and nobody was really looking at it. But what kept me going through it was this understanding that there had been hundreds and hundreds of people before me that had done this, and there would be hundreds of people after me who would leave a position of security or conformity to pursue work that they really cared about. So I wanted to go and find those people, and I wanted to go and understand from them how, through resilience and persistence, they eventually became the Scott Harrisons and the Lauren Bush Laurens and the Kunal Mehtas and Jack Dorseys and the Vin Vacantis and the Richard Bransons and the other entrepreneurs that I eventually speak with for disruptors. But I didn't want to focus on that ivory tower that we've heard about so often. I didn't want to focus on how they got venture funded or what was so good about their product or the press releases that we're so used to hearing. I wanted to focus on those first 6 months. So how did they bounce back from the early failures? How did they go from a room like this, a bunch of aspiring entrepreneurs like myself who have an idea? How do they find that first partner? How do they deal with the first set of funding? How do they understand what they needed to build with and test it with customers? So what do those first 6 months look like when they were nobody? And some interesting themes started coming out that surprised me also. And I want to plant an idea into this room. And I hope it becomes a basis for a lot of what you do in the coming months or years, depending on where you are right now. So the idea is this idea of embracing failure, realizing optionality, and thinking differently. So how many of you are familiar with a company called Spanx? Only all the women in the room. All right, so it's a shapewear and undergarment company. It was created by Sarah Blakely. And she's one of the youngest females on the Forbes billionaire list. And what Sarah credits to her success was the fact that every night when she would come home, her father would push her to fail. And at first thought, I thought that was a very wild concept, that what father would push his daughter to fail? It doesn't seem like great parenting. But as we got further into the interview, what Sarah was saying was every night when they would sit down for dinner, her father would ask her, Sarah, what did you fail at today? And if she didn't have a good enough answer, she had disappointed him. But what her father was trying to do was to get her to think outside of the traditional realm that so many people in business are used to thinking in. I mean, we operate in this very structured environment from maybe even middle school or high school when you start building out this resume to get into a top college. And then from a top college, you start building out the resume and recruiting every single summer for a job you really don't have much of an understanding about just because you think it's the right thing to do. So you keep operating in this environment and building out that resume and building out the application to make yourself look like the perfect candidate for a job that you might not even want. So what he wanted her to do was to think outside of that into pockets of innovation. So think outside when risks don't really matter and the implications of those risks aren't so serious. And by doing so, she started to test her limits and test her boundaries and find these places where nobody else was thinking and to find interesting ideas that she would be willing to dedicate the next decade to working on. So you might say that's only one case, and that's an outlier, and that's a success story that might not be the case in this room. But that's what I thought too when I was going into it. And then every single disruptor that I spoke with something like 30, 35 entrepreneurs, their thoughts on failure were pretty similar. So there's Kunal Mehta, and for the other Indian males in this room, I see a few, you might empathize with this. I can empathize with this. He had the courage to go to his family and tell them, I don't want to be a doctor. So he said, I want to be in business. So he went to the Wharton School of Business and began studying business and got an offer from Goldman Sachs to join them after graduating, which was one of the top firms. And he said he didn't want to take that offer letter. He has it hanging up in his office now. And he said, I don't want to be in banking because I know I'm not going to be happy there. What I really want to do is be an entrepreneur, and that's what's going to make me happy. So he graduated college, and he took a risk, and he secured $2 million in seed funding for a mobile application that was going to connect people with local events around them. Began building, finding some early successes, and hitting some milestones, but then the tech bubble crashed, and Nihal was forced to file for bankruptcy within a year. So now look around, and at 2021, you've been telling all of your friends that I'm not going to recruit, I'm not going to take this full-time job, and I'm going to do what I really care about. And I'm building this application, and you share it on Facebook, and you share it on Twitter, and you start talking about it everywhere, to every single person you meet, to get them fired up about it. And then all of a sudden, a year later, you're going back to those same people, those same friends, those same confidants, those same family, and telling them, I have to file for bankruptcy. So that's a pretty raw moment, and it's a raw moment that we don't hear about so often. And it was interesting to hear how he bounced back from that. But what Nihal knew was that he would not be, so most rational people at that point would go back and get a job and redeem themselves and work for 3 or 4 years and then maybe try it again. But Nihal knew that he wouldn't be happy no matter what, so he wanted to keep trying this, and he knew he just had to get better at being an entrepreneur. So he took some redeeming qualities out of that venture, built it out again for the next 3 or 4 years, and eventually sold that to Omnicom by learning from those early failures. Because he understood that this idea of an overnight success story is a huge misnomer that's been touted by the media, and he needs to just get better at it. So Nihal is now the founder. He's founded something like 4 or 5 other companies. He's a philanthropist in New York, and he recently closed a $55 million funding round to invest in mobile startups. So that's another story. And you might say, okay, that's another young guy. What about if I'm older in life? So there was Andrew Yang, who's a corporate lawyer, graduates from Columbia, and decides corporate law isn't something he wants to work in. So he sets up a nonprofit that's going to connect celebrities with interesting causes. Also within a year, he fails. And I remember for Disruptors, when we were sitting down, he said, I was lying there on the floor because I'd sold all my furniture to keep myself afloat, and I was wondering how I'd failed so miserably and so publicly. Because these failures are very public, and you're interacting with people that you're close to, and you're always wondering about what they're thinking about what you're doing. Andrew also bounced back from that. He said, I understand it's not the overnight success story. I have to embrace this early failure. I have to learn a little bit more from other entrepreneurs. And he did that for a couple of years and worked with other founders instead of going to a traditional job. And eventually he set up a fellowship called Venture for America, which is doing very well. And the idea behind that is to place aspiring entrepreneurs from universities into startups across the country so they can learn how to become better founders. So there's this idea of embracing failure, and it's something that comes up. I think there's probably, can you raise your hand if you're interested in social entrepreneurship and social impact? So, okay, so it's most of the room. So that's, this idea of embracing failure and thinking differently is something very big that comes up in social entrepreneurship and in NGOs and nonprofits, because you're deciding to take on these mammoth crises that some of the biggest NGOs haven't even been able to solve. So you have to get used to this idea of failing early on. I've been working for this nonprofit called Charity Water for the last 2 years, and it's a very interesting organization, but the story of its founder is very interesting. Scott Harrison started it, I think, 8 or 9 years ago, and he was a club promoter in New York City, living a life that most bankers would envy. He was poster boy for Budweiser and Bacardi, where they were paying him to drink their alcohol publicly. He was going out every night, had a beautiful loft in the city, was dating models, had a nice car, and he was living a pretty big life of decadence. And one night he was gambling in Punta del Este and hit this cathartic moment of reflection where he said, I'm not proud of the legacy that I'm leaving behind. And I want to do something different. I want to be someone different, like so many people before him. And like most people at that point, he said, okay, I'm going to go to Africa, and I'm going to volunteer, and I'm going to find what my calling is. So he goes to Africa on this medical brigade ship and begins as a photographer. But what he saw over there is something that I had the unique opportunity of seeing recently, and it changed my entire perspective on the work that we were doing. So we were in Ethiopia about a month ago, and we were driving miles and miles through completely barren land. And we hit this school where 700 students congregate every morning. It's in the middle of nowhere and completely dry land. It's harsh conditions. And we hiked down with them for about a mile to their local, to the water source, which is just a stream. And at the top of that stream, there's donkeys defecating, there's kids bathing, and in the water itself, there's tadpoles and worms and algae and all kind of unseen bacteria. And the woman that's collecting water is pouring it through her dress from one plastic container into another and trying to filter it through her dress. So it stops the branches and it stops some of the insects, but all the unseen bacteria is going in there, and then that same water is being used to feed her family, for cooking, for cleaning, and the entire family is drinking this water. And that's leading to some of the things that Scott saw, which was diarrhea, dysentery, flesh-eating bacteria, tumors, and a variety of other illnesses that are caused from this water source. And so Scott came back and he said, water is such a basic and elemental need that nobody should be deprived of. So he came back and he said, okay, I want to set up a nonprofit. Like many people in this room, ideas I've had also is like, let's set up a nonprofit and try to address certain causes. But the problem with the nonprofit, when he came back as a young visionary entrepreneur, what he realized was that when he was going out there and trying to get funding, people said, you know what, nonprofits are a black hole of funding. I put $1 in, I'm not really sure how much is actually going to the cause in need. Is it 50 cents, is it 80 cents, or is it 20 cents? How much is being cut for overhead costs and marketing and promotional events? So Scott said, okay, I'm going to flip the entire model on its head. And I'm going to say that if a public donation comes in, I'm going to give 100% of that directly to the people in need. And he had to innovate, he had to think differently about nonprofit models, and he had to think about other solutions so that he can gain the trust of donors and actually bring the cause home to them. And he said, okay, I'm going to set up a separate bank account that will fund our operational account, our operational expenses from a private group of donors. And that began to work, and it began to resonate with donors. And then he said, the problem is that a lot of the stories that we tell are inciting sort of sympathy, and they're not empowering stories. So he began to bring back stories from the field of a woman who now didn't have to spend 5 or 6 hours collecting water from her family, but could now go and entrepreneurially sell trinkets in the local market, because so much of her time wasn't spent on this water walk, because they now built local wells right there, close to her home. So stories like that and the branding around nonprofits, where he said that we can't think about nonprofits and feel guilty about building a nice website and telling a good story. We have to think about this the same way an Airbnb or an Apple would think about branding. And that slowly started to work. And in the last 8 years, they've built something like over 16,000 water projects. Again, it's served 5.2 million people in 24 different countries. So I think that's impact that really matters, but it happens by young visionary entrepreneurs like ourselves who think differently about these crises, the other ways the other NGOs haven't. And I think that begins with this idea of embracing those early failures and thinking differently. I'm not going to go on for too long, but I just want to leave with one final thought, and that's this sexiness and the craziness around startups and entrepreneurship has become a little bit disgusting. It's become about the press releases. It's become about who's on the cover of Forbes and who's tweeting what and who's following who and the headshots and all this other stuff that's going on. But I think it's less about that. And what I've noticed in these conversations and across colleges is the reason that entrepreneurship is blowing up is because these are men and women living life on their own terms. And they're doing the work that they really care about, and they're having impact in a way that is meaningful to them and to the users that they're working with, whatever industry they're working in. So I think that's something that we should pay attention to. It's not about the funding and it's not about the valuations. It's more about finding work that you really care about. And I think that begins with this idea of embracing failure, thinking differently, and realizing that you have options with your career early on. Thanks a lot for having me, and we can open up to any questions, concerns, discussion, whatever. Yeah, thanks. Yes.
So I'm just wondering how the entrepreneurs are going to get in contact with people that are specialists in their area. So, for instance, I'm a physician. I'm interested in you doing your telemedicine. How do I meet people that have the business sense such that you can use my expertise and we actually have kind of union?
Yeah.
The reason why I bring that up is I'm thinking of one kind of popular failure, plate pump.
Okay.
So that was a water delivery system that was set up in Africa. And it was wonderful, and it was basically kids going in a merry-go-round to help pump the water. It was set up, and then it was an epic fail after Gates got behind it and all of these other things.
Right.
I see that as a very public failure as we're talking about, but if that's the entrepreneur who's come up with that idea, but you haven't thought ahead with the social scientists or the whomever is going to be a specialist in that,
Yeah.
doing yourself a bit.
Right.
I'm wondering, how do we connect?
Yeah.
And kind of use our respective areas of knowledge.
Absolutely. So I think that's like in its very basic sense. I think it's very interesting in terms of, especially people at business schools. Like I think when I was in business school, the core problem was that all of us were business students, and we all thought that our business skills were enough to start a company. But you need developers, you need lawyers, you need all these people. So luckily, colleges are breeding grounds. So that's a perfect starting point. But one website that I would recommend that you look at is Founders Dating. And it's interesting people who are professionals in their respective spaces who are interested in starting companies or at least advising. So there's so many meetup groups that are also happening now where it's bringing really interesting people out who are all trying to address a certain problem. It doesn't have to be in social impact. It could be something like in medicine. But they're all coming together and from different walks of life and bringing out these ideas in these meetups. So General Assembly does a bunch of them. I'm not sure what their presence is here, but they have online meetups also. Tech in Motion is another one, and they're in a lot of the big cities. But Founders Dating is a good place to start because it's all online, and you get to meet some interesting people there. Some of the other ones I would recommend is like Hacker News. You can find some of the people that are writing about certain topics and reach out to them because usually they have networks. I use LinkedIn all the time for this. I just type in, like especially with the venture that I'm working on now, we've found a lot of the physicians that we want to partner with, and we've found other people that are doing in the space. So to actually go and speak with the entrepreneurs that are doing it now is pretty helpful. So I think LinkedIn would be one of the bigger ones. And the other good part is like Odesk and Elance, you can hire freelancers. So what we're doing with our venture is we've hired a freelancer based out of Indonesia, and she's researching physicians for us to contact. So that's starting to set up some partnerships also over there. So she gives us the contact information, we reach out, and we start discussing with them. But it's good because the entire scene is becoming so much smaller. And I've noticed that when you're interacting with people that are starting up companies, it doesn't matter how many years of experience they have, everybody's at the same playing field, which is awesome. So there's no real big egos or anything when you're trying to start up a company, which is awesome. But yeah. Is there anybody else? Yeah.
So going back to like your telemedicine
Mhm.
theory, how do you deal with like all the competitors who are starting similar companies? Like
Yeah. Yeah, so the competitive space has kind of exploded recently. We began working on it about a year ago, and Doctors on Demand, Teladoc, Ring-a-Doc, there's a number of companies that are out there. None of the names are very good, so hopefully Outpatients is better, but that's the only thing we're winning in right now. It's a very competitive space, but luckily right now, because of legislation, the bounds of telehealth are bound by state lines. So many of them are focusing on it in California, and they're moving westward. We've started in New York State, and we're hoping to move east. But we're still in like the iteration process, and we're going through it, and we're working with investors, and we're working with doctors and physicians to find out what our unique niche should be. Because there's some that are only focused on women's health. There's some that are focused on the senior population. There's some that are focused on mental health. So we're trying to find our unique niche also and figure out exactly what does the market need. But a lot of these startups have kind of expanded recently, and there's like a lot of room for consolidation. So our hope is that we begin working on it, sign up physicians, find something that they actually really need, because their profit margins are also squeezed, and then eventually work with the other startups in the space. So that's why we're interacting with like the founders of Doctors on Demand and Teladoc to also work with them also. So.
How'd you start finding funding for this?
So we haven't found funding yet, and we're not actively looking. We're kind of in conversations right now. But our idea is, and it's an interesting thing, there's one entrepreneur in Disruptors called Brett Martin, who we had a panel with Brett Martin and some of the other venture capitalists, and they all went head to head and got into this big argument about whether entrepreneurs actually need funding or not. And I was actually having a conversation in the hall before with some entrepreneurs. But the idea is that if we're building a business, we want to try to build it in a sustainable way that actually the revenue model is pretty clear early on. So if we don't need money to expand right now, we'd rather get the money in and then reinvest it. I think we would need venture funding more for the networks and to expand it. But right now we're iterating and we're testing it with small user groups just to really see if we're on point before we start approaching investors. Because a bad partnership with an investor that might not have the same interests can really just destroy the entire vision. So, yeah.
How does
serial entrepreneur, what has your journey been like in terms of deciding which projects to take on, and how have those projects kind of culminated for you? Did you just find them serendipitously, or?
Yeah, so I won't take credit for being a serial entrepreneur. I'm not even an entrepreneur yet, because I think that title has thrown around so often, where it's like if you're sitting in a bathtub and you're trying to think of a genius idea, you just call yourself an entrepreneur. So I'm not going to say I'm that yet until I've succeeded. But I think for ideas, where I've usually gotten them is really and I think I did this wrong for a very long time. Like I've always had this desire to be an entrepreneur since a pretty young age, and I had some very stupid ideas along the way. So I'll share one with you that I hope we can just leave in this room. But when I was leaving Wall Street, I started getting desperate for a business idea to work on, because I had set a time limit for myself that if I don't find something I'm interested in working on, or this job doesn't get better, then I'm going to just leave at the end of 3 months. So at the 3-month mark it came, and it was 2 weeks before I gave my 2-week notice, and I didn't have anything I wanted to work on. I couldn't find another organization that I was interested in at that time. And I said, okay, I'm going to take 5 or 6 months to really figure out what that is. What's the next step? And this was before I had the idea for Disruptors or anything. And in that desperation, I think ideas just keep flowing through your mind. I'm sure everybody in this room goes through that. Like you're laying down at night and you just keep thinking of new things or ideas that you have, and you go and test it out and you talk to people. Oh, like what if we did this? So one of those ideas that I had, and again, this is pretty terrible, but there's a frozen yogurt chain in New York called 16 Handles. And the idea behind it is that you pour frozen yogurt in a cup. You pour toppings on it, you weigh it, and then you give it to the register for whatever you're paying for. So I was thinking, okay, let's flip that, because if there's so many, like there's an entire juicing phase and everybody's getting into juicing, let's give people blenders and make them pour vegetables and fruits into it and let them just weigh their own smoothie. You even in disbelief that that's an idea, but yeah. So I started just brainstorming with that for like 3 weeks. And at the end of 3 weeks, I'm like, I can't see myself doing this. I would never actually want to do this. I would never actually want to build this out, because of the brick and mortar, and you've got to go through the entire process of it. But in terms of like going through ideas, so from start to finish with that one, and what a lot of the entrepreneurs said when I spoke to them for Disruptors was that sit with an idea for a little while. Like if you have an idea, sit with it maybe for 2 weeks and see if it's still something that you're really passionate about. And also get into your head that this isn't an overnight success story. So you're not going to do this for next year. You have to be willing to give yourself the next decade for this. So if it doesn't work out right away, will you be willing to fail and keep trying at it from different angles for the next decade? So that's like one parameter for your idea. And the second one, which I've slowly gotten better at, which I never used to do in the beginning, is go through rapid iteration with your ideas. So Google Ventures does something called design sprints. You guys should put every single idea you have through that framework. Whether it's a social impact or it's for profit, these things are amazing in terms of refocusing your vision around the company. So Google Ventures came out with something called design sprints, and then ThoughtBot has kind of reconfigured it and giving you exact questions that you should look at. But that helps take your idea from a starting point and within 5 days design it out, prototype it in a PDF format, and then put it in front of users to get initial feedback on that idea. Because if an idea is sitting behind, and what I did for so long and what I did wrong was that every time I had an idea, my first instinctive reaction was to go behind a computer and research it, and research competitors in the space, and research what are they doing, and then just start building it. So pay a freelancer or write a business plan. And that's like everything I did without actually going and talking to customers and seeing if it's something they need, which should be the first thing you do. So Steve Blank had actually said, like, no business plan is ever going to survive first interaction with the customer. So I think that's something you should really take to heart, is when you have an idea, put it in front of a customer as quickly as possible and take their feedback and then just reiterate on your idea. So that's what I do with a lot of the ideas I've had. I just went on. I'm not sure if I answered any of your questions, but I mean, it's like, I think it's the same thing for a lot of people. And what you'll notice with a lot of the people in the book is that, the entrepreneurs in the book, is that they've gone through 8, 9, 10, 12 different ideas before they eventually hit on one that they really want to work on. But you get better. But like other ideas that we go through also, like my partner and I might move away from this and we might set up something else. What we do is we go through a process of ideation for 3 or 4 days, where we lay out a bunch of industries that we'd be interested in on a very broad standpoint, and don't think about the idea first, and then go and talk to people in that space. So there's one guy in the book, Hirsch Otherwall, who started a company called Branch, and he sold it to Facebook. and I recently had lunch with him, and he's at Facebook now, and he's thinking, okay, what's the next step? And he's saying he's very interested in agriculture. Because he's like, they're shipping agriculture back and forth, and the entire space, technology really hasn't touched it yet. So he just started getting interested in it as a space, and now what he's doing is he doesn't have a specific idea yet, but what he's doing is he's just going to every conference, reading every book, reading every article, meeting experts in the space to see how can technology be associated with this. So he's not building off of other startups that are there, but he's just finding solutions based off the problems that people are having. So it's a good place to start to find ideas and to think about it. Yeah.
What was kind of one of the most shocking things you learned on your kind of journey interviewing all those different people?
I think the big one is how long people stick with it and how stubborn they are and how resilient they keep going through with it. I think my entire impression when I was leaving Wall Street would be people try it for 6 months to a year, and if it doesn't work out, they go back. And I was proven wrong like 110% of the time because people don't go back. And what I've noticed is that they do it, and even if they fail, they just keep sticking with it because they get better at it and they get this high off of being able to work for themselves and seeing the progress they've made, and that every single hour they worked on was towards something they really cared about, that they can't go back to a 9-to-5 job or a 9-to-6 job. And I thought that was pretty interesting, is that they stick with it for 3, 4, 5 years and slowly get better at it. So they're not taking huge risks with their family or their life savings, but they take calculated risks, and eventually one of the entrepreneurs in the book, I think it was Nahal, said, he's like, there's no remotely, no, it was Chris Dixon. I think he was Chris Dixon said that there's no remotely intelligent entrepreneur who's ever failed. Because if you stick with it long enough, you're eventually going to find that success. It's like all the big baseball players also. It's like every swing of the bat makes you closer to home run. So I think it's just sticking with it and having that resilience that I think stood out. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Blogs, news sources, websites, etc. Would you recommend that?
Yeah, so there's a really good book I read. It's called Disruptor, so I would start there. But I think there's a ton of really good, there's so much out there now, which is really interesting because the space is blowing up so much. But I think start with, if you have an idea already and you're thinking about how to execute on it, because there's two different schools of thought. If you have an idea, what should you read to bring you to the next level? In that case, I would read Lean Startup, Eric Ries, and then there's Steve Blank's textbook, and it's how to start a startup. And it's a very heavy read, but the lessons in there are so good that it'll change the entire way you think of a company. So those are two that you could read from that context. But just to keep yourself updated on the space, sign up for some of the newsletters that the venture capitalists and the entrepreneurs are writing. There's an entrepreneur, Vin Vacanti. I actually met him through here, but his blog is very interesting because it's pretty candid and gives you actual advice. Vin Vacanti is his name. And then Fred Wilson is another pretty big VC in New York who writes a blog. And he releases a lot of good information. There's Gary's Guide, who has a newsletter. And that's like some of the big events that are going on in any city. Who are the new big startups that are coming out? There's so many of them. And you can email me after and I'll send you just a ton of links. And then you can decide and curate whichever ones work for you. But I can work with Catherine on that, and we can get a big list out to everybody. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
To follow up on Catherine's question from earlier, so would you say that like one of the biggest things that was shocking to you is that people stuck with it? Do you mean stuck with the whole entrepreneurship thing overall, or do you mean specifically the idea that they started working on and then kept working on that until they beat it to?
No, I'm really glad you brought that up. Actually, they stuck with entrepreneurship, and what I've noticed is that the ones that continued to fail were the ones that got too married to the idea early on. So they found some this medical thing, for example. There's a very strong chance we're going to move away from it because it's just getting too frustrating to continue working in, and it's a few months in. I think when you get too married to a concept too early on, you just keep pouring money into it and it doesn't necessarily work out. And that's what I've seen a couple of the entrepreneurs do for 3 or 4 years. They keep chasing an idea because it becomes like a boyfriend and a girlfriend where they've spent the last 3 years investing in, and now they can't move away from it. But you had to see it the same way you would see a stock position for any of the finance guys in here. It's when is your stop loss? At what point are you willing to cut it off? So I think that's why this 5-day Google Sprint thing really helps people move on from ideas. So if the idea is not working, you get it in front of customers and take their feedback seriously. And then iterate on it. And if that's not working either, then consider, like, when do I have to cut the cord and move on to the next thing? Because I think there's nothing more harmful than pouring more money and more time and more of your personal energy into an idea that might not work. So that's something that there's a distinction between they stuck with entrepreneurship and the lifestyle and the idea of working for themselves, and not with the ideas that weren't working. But in some cases, like Nihal and Vin Vikanti and all of them, they start a venture and it doesn't work. But they cut it there, but they might take redeeming qualities of something that they saw work well. So it might be a certain technology type, like the way they built that out, or the design, or the UI, or the partners that they worked with. So you can take parts from a venture and redeem those towards something else. Yeah, and in hindsight, you should take my feedback on this. Great. Don't take it too seriously, because again, my own personal motivations are very different. And I think there's too many people right now who are shitting on Wall Street and shitting on consulting and saying that it's the worst industry and it's all devils and it's all Satan and don't go there, which isn't true. Like, the people, 99% of the people I worked with were amazing, and they were doing it for their families, and they were doing it because it's a secure job. Personally, I knew I wasn't happy there, so I wanted to get out. So I think that's something I'm trying to force, is that if you know within 3 months you're not going to be happy there, just get out. Don't do it just because you think it's the right career path. In terms of actual skills, I think this is something that's interesting, is that a lot of people do Wall Street and say, I'm gonna work on Wall Street for the next 5 years so that eventually I can do what I really care about. Don't do that either. That's like, because there's too many people that end up just sticking with it and do it for the next 10 years and have a midlife crisis later on. In terms of the skills that you can learn, there's a level of professionalism that you get that I think once you have the name on your resume, then when you go to places, they're gonna give you a certain level of respect. But to be completely honest with you, is that all of these places, they keep touting this idea of transferable skills. And I don't believe in it at all. When I went to Charity Water, they looked at the resume, and we're still getting so many applications of people that are applying in, and the resumes all look very cookie cutter. It's McKinsey, it's BCG, it's Goldman Sachs, it's JP Morgan, it's Deloitte, and I had this calling where I want to do more interesting work. But their resumes are all exactly alike, and they've done nothing to differentiate it or show some interest in social impact. And when I came here, I thought that coming from JP Morgan and coming from Nomura and coming from these big banks, I would be one of the smartest people at a nonprofit. It's like an ego thing that you come in there and you're like, if I've worked here, there's no way a nonprofit's going to challenge me. It'll be an easy breeze. And I couldn't be more wrong, because the people that are working there in business, like our skill sets, they're valuable. But there's people that have learned UI design, and they've learned UX, and they've learned the legal side of businesses, and they've learned how to develop, and they've learned how to market, or they've understood certain social media segments and fundraising segments, and these entire skills that we don't think about when we're in business school, because we're thinking about only finance and marketing. And I think those are the ones that are really getting the respect in the organization, because they're actually contributing something towards the growth of a company. So if your end goal is to be an entrepreneur, Wall Street's not going to teach you anything, or consulting's not going to teach you. It might teach you a little bit, and again, take my perspective. You can talk to a couple of people and see what the general consensus is, but I think it's actually going out there and doing it and building it where you start to learn stuff. Because when I was on Wall Street, my perspective was narrow. It was equity derivative trading, and that's my only skill that I got very good at. But when you're starting a company, you have to think about all of those avenues. You have to think legally, the design, the creative, the marketing, sales, and all these avenues that you only get good at when you're actually building a company or working at a startup close to a founder. So if your end goal is that, then I don't think it's much of it's worth your time going and working there. So, yes.
So at the time you decided to leave Wall Street, have you already tested your idea in the market, see if there is a valid market for it or not? And what was your plan B in case this idea failed, given that 90% of ventures fail and you might run out of money and...
Yeah. So I actually didn't have an idea when I left Wall Street. I had that stupid idea, the juice idea. And that was also just like grasping for straws. It was trying to find something that would work. And I had several ideas when I was on Wall Street, and I tested them. I invested money in them. There was one that we were working on this was pre-Venmo too. And this was a mobile payments sharing system, and a friend and I built it. But again, our perspective was very naive at that point. I mean, we're like, oh, we'll go to freelance and we'll try to build this out and see where it goes, which we should have been doing the 5-day sprint and testing ideas quickly with customers. So I didn't have an idea yet, but my plan was that if it hit the year, I think it was 9 months in. It was 3 months in where I realized I didn't want to do this. And then I set a deadline for myself for the full year, and I would leave. And 9 months hit, started panicking. You come home every night, you start applying to jobs, but all the jobs start to look exactly alike. You're like, oh, you know what, I can go to a hedge fund, and it might be something different, but it's all going to be the same. And then you think, oh, I just want to go work in startups. But startups, and then at that time, when you're in that, you're like, oh, I'll work at Facebook. It's a startup. It's not a startup. It's a company. And like you think of all these jobs that are out there, but they're all they might be exactly alike unless you know what industry you really want to work in. So like what industry drives you and what makes you tick and those personal motivations, which I wasn't getting that when I was on Wall Street. So I said, okay, I'm going to set my deadline at the full year mark. The full year mark hit, and I chickened out and I couldn't leave. So I set a couple of other more months, and then I finally left, because I couldn't find anything that was inspiring. And what I did in that time was I started to save money and live my life the same way I would if I was unemployed. And I said, okay, if I save X amount of dollars, that's going to last me 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever it is. And I really have to stop going and getting bottle service to my friends at clubs. I need to stop going out every night. I need to stop eating at restaurants. I got to figure out how to cook, and I got to learn all these different things that will help me lead a life of an entrepreneur. So go back to freshman year of college and start eating ramen every night. It wasn't that bad. Not for the freshmen in the room that your life is bad. Sorry about that. But it's just like you had to change your lifestyle, and I was happy doing that because I was noticing the way my lifestyle was going, I wasn't proud of it. It was just like you start to live a different life because you start to think that you're earning this money and you deserve this kind of money. But nobody at that age deserves that kind of money. So I changed the entire perspective on it and how long would it last me. And I started taking some calculated risks around what would I be willing to do for income if this runs out. There's like TaskRabbit, and there's all these other sources of income that people get creative with. Luckily that never happened, because then like 2-3 months in I had this idea, and then I did a Kickstarter for it, and then we started selling, and then eventually the apartment business came. And that's what I've noticed with a lot of the entrepreneurs that leave, is that when you finally leave and you don't have a steady paycheck coming in, they start to get a little desperate, and they actually start to work, and they start to find things to get creative with their income, and they find these ventures that eventually work out. But it's about those calculated risks, and it's about looking at your own risk appetite, because the profiles that I have in disruptors are of completely different people. There's people that just dropped out of college, so I'm going to take a risk. I'm not going to get a college degree, and I don't have any savings, and I'm going to see where this all goes. And they took the biggest risks possible. Then there's these other two entrepreneurs who founded Bobble Bar, and they were on the other side of the spectrum, where they weren't willing to leave a position of security until they had their venture backed by venture capitalists. So the two ladies went through 2 years as analysts in a bank. They had their idea then. It was a jewelry startup. And they decided to apply to business school because they saw that as like they'll have the most time to go through with it. And if it doesn't work out, they always have business school to fall back on. In business school, they iterated, they tested it with their users, and they drew out the process for 2 years. They still recruited for full-time jobs after. They got the full-time offers. And in the 3 months between graduating from business school and starting that, they really went hard on this, showed venture capitalists the progress they had made, got funded. And then I think like 10 or 2 weeks before they started their jobs, they called up their employers and were like, sorry, we're going to renege on those offers, and we're going to go for this full-time. But they'd already gotten venture-backed. So I think it's just like looking at the risk appetite you're willing to take on and see, what do I need to do right now? But it's me personally, and maybe this is the case for most people in the room, it's very tough when you have a secure paycheck coming in to take any venture seriously, unless you're very dedicated to it. So there's a 17-year-old, this guy is, he's like a child genius, but he was one of the early founders of Pinterest. And he left Pinterest with a lot of equity on the table to start up his own thing. And he was at Pinterest getting paid, but what he said is that if I wake up every morning So I'd be at work at 9:30. If I wake up every morning at 6, I'm not going to waste that time. I'm actually going to spend those 3 hours working on the new venture, because otherwise I'm going to be miserable for waking up this early. So that's an interesting idea. If you're working a job, set it up so you're not trying to do this when you come home at night and when you have dinner conflicting plans and plans with friends. Do it in the morning early on before you go to work. Or find like certain segments of time where you're not going to do anything else but work on this. So it's like a different way of calculating the risks and seeing what you're willing to take on. So. Yeah.
So I think just in general, I guess entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship has been gaining a lot of momentum over the past few decades. But every time I guess it's brought up in discussion, it's always said that it's a very difficult field to succeed in, and you do have to have these like few failures. And you mentioned I guess resources and infrastructure in the past few years, like Venture for America and Founders Dating.
Right.
We have great books to read.
Yeah.
But I think what I guess my question for you is, what type of infrastructure or resources do you wish you had in your entrepreneurial experiences, or do you think that would help future entrepreneurs, or if there's anything coming down the pipe that's going to be a lot easier for entrepreneurs, or is it just a field that you kind of have to go and figure it out yourself?
Right. Yeah. So that's awesome, but I think there's like a few parts to that, and one of the big ones was that I wish that my university had done it, and it sounds like Duke is doing an amazing job with that, so you guys are lucky. But I hoped that my college would do that, but I think it was a little bit before the time. And what our college was focusing on was more getting the students into finance and into consulting. But the network that universities can create is amazing. And what I've noticed is that a lot of them, in traveling across all of them, is that they're putting so much funding behind this because they're realizing that this is what students really want to do. They want to find work that they care about after graduating. And entrepreneurship is just a word for that. But it's really like students just want to find work that they can actually be interested in, instead of going through the cycle of a repeatable job for 6 years and then realize they hate it anyway. So that's one thing, is like, I wish I had that university support. But one thing in terms of like structuring this as a venture, and I'm not sure if that's what you're trying to get at, but I think I wish there is something that could, it's very hard for someone with a specific skill set, this goes back to the question that we came up with earlier, to find other people to partner with. And Founder Dating does an okay job with that, but and there's other networks where you can go and find a freelancer and you can pay them. So for example, when I had the idea for the medical network, I had to pay a freelancer in India to build the venture itself. But now, a couple of months in, I got lucky. I met a programmer who came very interested in the idea. He's like, don't pay me, let's just do it as partners. Which I wish there was more networks for that, to meet people who are interested in a project, interested in a product, that are willing not to do it for money, or willing to take the same kind of risk and build it out. So if you convert that into an idea, you need to start up a company. You need, most of the time you don't even need them, but maybe someone in business, a developer, and I think a designer who can design, because now design is becoming so big because everybody wants to look like Airbnb and Apple, and it doesn't have to just be functional, it's got to be really pretty. So if you have a team like that, you're kind of set, because then you keep iterating. But it's hard to connect those parties because you have them in tech schools, you have them in business schools, and you have them in the other major design institutes. So what my vision was, and for a product, the way it could look is that you put up a profile of a person who is an entrepreneur in one of these areas, and it becomes like a dating website just for people that are interested in the same things. And then the network itself, the website itself, would curate the talent on the website. So you'll just partner you up. You don't have to go through freelancers. You don't have to go through any of that. It just tells you, here's your team of 3 people, and start working together. And it looks up like location, like a Tinder, but for setting up a company, something useful. Yeah. Somewhat useful. Yeah, so I think that it'd just be easier if those networks were there in place, and I think it's something that still everybody's struggling with. Like, I still talk to all my friends, and like, we want to start an idea, we can't find a developer, we can't find a designer. And luckily, like, some of the startups are hotbeds for that, because then you meet other interesting people, but it should be easier than that to find people that want to start companies. So, yeah.
So you mentioned failure a lot. I was wondering, how did you open yourself up to failure, and how's like your relationship with failure changed over the years?
Yeah, so I failed a bunch of times, but nowhere in the way that these men and women did. My failures were smaller. They were in jobs, they were investing in ideas that were pretty bad, and trying to bounce back from them and realize that, like, not get too discouraged early on. So I've been trying to do this for a long time. And some ideas have worked out really well, and some have worked out very poorly. So I'll give you another idea that I worked on, which was, I was in, I think, a freshman in high school, or sophomore, or something like that. And I had this idea, like, there's all these people that you read about that are import-exporters that are doing these big businesses. And I'm like, oh, it's such a fascinating concept that I can import something from China on one of the big websites, or Taiwan, or India, and resell it on Amazon. So I started importing, I was like, okay, what's something small where the margins might be high? So I started importing golf balls from China, and they were Titleist golf balls. And I started selling them on Amazon at like a pretty high markup for what other competitors were selling them at. So I thought I was a genius, and I was doing this for a couple of weeks, and like selling them, and I had placed a huge order after the first couple of sold, and I had boxes and boxes in my basement. And then my cousin, who I really look up to, he was doing business at General Mills, he's probably like 5 or 6 years older than me, slapped me over the head and was like, you're gonna be in jail for fraud because you're basically selling fake golf balls online. So I thought, I mean, I didn't know at the time that those were fake golf balls, but now I have boxes and boxes of golf balls in my basement. So it's like ideas like that failed in the beginning, but it gives you some, it's like some energy behind it, because you do it, you find out, okay, you were a complete idiot, and then you move on, and then you move on to the next idea, and you realize, okay, I can't violate trade law anymore. I got to find something that works domestically, and something maybe a little bit different. And now the idea is, the way I'm failing, my appetite for failure has changed in terms of some of the projects that I want to work on. Like this real estate project, it's a proven business model. And if you invest in real estate, in my sense, in New York, if your business itself isn't going to work, you still have the real estate at the end of the day. So now I want to focus more on sustainable revenue models as opposed to just ideas. Like, I don't want to create the next social network. I think there's too many people trying to do that already. But I think before I go into a venture, I want to see that there's an actual revenue model as opposed to looking at it and saying, oh, I can get these many users and then get venture backed. Because I think there is a bubble forming, and I think if venture funding dries up, then all the ventures are screwed. So I'd rather have a sustainable revenue model so that the mission doesn't fail. But it's going through this iteration process too, within 5 days to know, so that you're not always failing. So eventually you start succeeding. If you can go through those 5 days, go through user testing and find out exactly how many people are going to use it, what are they going to use it for, then you get a good sense of what this looks like for the trajectory for the next year or beyond. So they're kicking me out? Yeah.
At what point of your venture do you recommend start looking for a team?
Sorry, I couldn't hear that.
At what point of your venture do you recommend start looking for a team?
Oh, okay. So again, I think it's very tough to find a team. I would use some of the resources I said, but I think it's more getting out there and not sitting behind a computer and trying to find people, but it's going to like these meetups and sessions. But I would do it pretty early on, because what I've noticed in trying to set it up by myself is that it's nobody that you can actually bounce ideas off of. So you run with one idea for a long time and then realize it's not going to work. And my personality, also the way it is very aggressive and let's just go for it and see what happens. My partner that I'm working with is more structured, and he's the one that's kind of implemented these ideas of process orientation and going through 5-day user testing and things like that. So it helps is in terms of having another partner to bounce ideas off of and think differently about things. I would do it early on, because if you're trying to get that entire wide spectrum of skills like legal, sales, marketing, business design, development, it's easier to chop that up and find someone who brings a completely different skill set to the table, let them handle it so you don't have to worry about all of that. But again, in the beginning, you're going to have to really convince them that the idea is something that they should work on, not for cash, but for equity. Because otherwise you're just going to keep pouring more in and hoping that they kind of work for it. But if you can get them passionate about it and thinking about it, then their equity is worth something and they actually want to work for it. So it's more sweat equity. And I think you can find a ton of people that would be willing to do that. Because I know I've been downplaying business skills, but developers and designers, they still recognize that that's what they need. They need someone that can go into a room and talk to venture capitalists and do projections and write out the entire business plan and figure out exactly how we're going to do customer segmentation and how are we going to market this, how are we going to sell it. And that's something that the entire business students bring in. So they're looking for us as partners also. Is there anybody else? Yeah.
So what are some of the qualities you look for in your partners versus co-founders?
It was exactly that. It was just that they should bring, I just want them to be as fired up about the project that we're working on as I am. Because there could be nothing worse that you've decided to quit your job or you've decided to leave college and not have a job or not have a steady paycheck in, and you're willing to work from 9 a.m. until 12 a.m. every day because it's your baby and it's something you care about, and they might not be. So that's why I think you can pay people early on to do work for you, but it's more effective to have someone that has equity in it where it might be worth something to them also. So if they can have that same kind of passion, and then also a very different skill set than me. Because too many times in the past I've partnered with people that same exact personality, same exact skill set, but at the end of the day we're always going to hit the same roadblocks because he or she can't speak to me for about the development side or the sales side. So it helps to bring someone with a different skill set than you. Yeah.
So about business skills, so I think many of us are kind of techie side of this part. So is that necessary to go for MBA in the process of entrepreneur, or just
That's a tough one to answer. No, So I mean, I think you're saying that most of the people in this room are have tech skills.
For example, me are really kind of engineering side of things.
Oh, okay.
Very technology.
Yeah.
But when developing a venture, we have to have those business skills. Is that right?
So in terms of, yeah, I definitely think you do. And I think, so an MBA can supplement that because now a lot of them are coming up to the curve and funding the entrepreneurship program. So I know a lot of the big ones have accelerators on campus where you come in and it gives you access to the entire network of proven entrepreneurs that have done it before. So MBAs are pretty valuable in terms of that. But there's a lot that you can learn also on your own just through using case studies. Because business itself is really just, you need to know how to talk to investors, and you need to present the entire business plan in terms of it being worthwhile something to invest in. So I think if you go out there and you start meeting these founders and these business people and finding out exactly what kind of advice they can give you and what kind of mentorship they can give you to structure your business so it has that trajectory, you start to do case studies. So that's why a lot of the MBA programs also use case studies to teach it. That's why, I mean, this time I'm not joking about the book, but this time I was like, I'm serious that what I thought would be most helpful is doing it through case studies in terms of how have other entrepreneurs done it. I think that's most helpful instead of like just reading through a book. So you can start there, but even if you email me after, I can send you more resources on it to figure that out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's what we are starting here. Like.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's like all the networks too in colleges and MBA programs that you start getting access to. Yeah. Anybody else? Thank you so much, everybody. Appreciate it.